I keep a journal. I've kept one since I was 11 years old, when my grandmother pressed a water-damaged notebook into my hands and told me that the only things worth remembering were the things nobody else bothered to write down. She was a practical woman, my grandmother. Born in a fishing village outside Reykjavik, she'd watched her entire coastal community disappear under rising water before she turned 30. She didn't romanticize things. She just wrote them down. So when everything happened, and I do mean everything, the whole impossible cascade of events that I'm about to describe to you, I wrote it down too. Every morning, every night, sometimes in the middle of a shift when I had 30 seconds and a thought I didn't want to lose. I wrote in longhand, on actual paper, with a pen that ran out of ink twice before we found what we found. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what follows isn't a report exactly. It isn't the kind of sanitized, institution-approved narrative that the Assembly will release to the public in 6 months, with all the rough edges smoothed away and all the fear carefully removed. What follows is what actually happened, what it felt like, what we said to each other in the dark when we didn't know if we were going to make it. My name is Dr. Maren Voss. I'm 43 years old. I spent 18 years working for the Galactic Integration Bureau, the JIB, which we all privately called the JIB, because it rhymed with crib, and that's exactly where they kept us. Safely contained, developmentally limited, watched over by species who considered us charming but essentially helpless. And then 4 years ago, on a Tuesday, the galaxy told us to leave. Let me explain how that works, for anyone who wasn't alive during the expulsion or was too young to understand it at the time. The Galactic Concordat, that's the governing body, the interstellar equivalent of the old United Nations except with actual enforcement mechanisms and a navy, had been admitting Earth to what they called provisional associate status for about 60 years. 60 years of being almost members. Of having observer seats at councils we couldn't vote in. Of being invited to trade negotiations we weren't allowed to participate in. Of being welcomed, warmly and condescendingly, to a civilization we were never quite part of. The formal justification was the Developmental Threshold Index, the DTI. Every species had one, a composite score measuring technological maturity, psychological stability, ecological responsibility, and what the Concordat diplomatically called intercivilizational empathy. You had to hit a certain DTI before you could apply for full membership. Earth had been hovering just below that threshold for decades. And then, 4 years ago, the Concordat reviewed our DTI score and decided we weren't just below the threshold. They decided we were regressing. They pointed to the Meridian Conflict, a resource dispute in the asteroid belt between two Earth nations that had gotten genuinely, embarrassingly violent. They pointed to the algae collapse in the Pacific, which was our fault and everyone knew it. They pointed to 3 separate human-run colonies that had violated Concordat environmental protocols. And they pointed, this was the one that hurt the most, I think, to a leaked internal JIB memo in which a senior human administrator had described a Keth delegation as glorified mud-eaters. Someone wrote that. A human being sat down and wrote those words about a species that had been nothing but patient with us, and then someone else leaked it, and then the Concordat had their excuse. They called it a temporary developmental pause, a suspension of Earth's provisional associate status, pending reassessment. We had 30 standard days to recall all personnel from Concordat space. Our trade agreements were suspended. Our transit corridors were revoked. The 6 human vessels currently operating under Concordat licensing, including the INS Meridian, my ship, had their authorizations canceled. We were, to use the plain word, expelled. I was on Caliph Station when the notification came through. I remember exactly where I was standing in line at a food dispensary, holding a tray of something that tasted vaguely like mushrooms, but definitely wasn't, waiting to pay with a credit chit that would be worthless in 30 days. The station loudspeakers made an announcement in 17 languages, the way they always did. I caught the Keth translation before the standard English, which is a strange way to learn that your entire species has been collectively fired. Around me, the station population, Keth, Vrali, a cluster of tall, gray-skinned Mindari, two Ush who moved in that unsettling synchronized way they had, went quiet for about 4 seconds. Then they went back to their business, because for them this wasn't news exactly. This was something they'd expected, maybe something some of them had wanted. The human beings on the station, there were maybe 40 of us, researchers and trade representatives and one very confused family of tourists from New Auckland who'd saved for years for this trip. We all looked at each other, and none of us knew what to say. A Mindari woman whose name I'd never learned looked at me across the dispensary. She was very tall, the way they all were, with those wide silver-pupiled eyes that always seemed faintly sorrowful regardless of mood. She said something in her own language that I didn't catch, and then she walked away. The human woman next to her, Priya, one of the Jib's junior analysts, told me later that what the Mindari woman had said translated roughly to, "They always go eventually." Like we were seasons, like we were weather. Like this was just a thing that happened, species coming and going, and it wasn't personal, it was just the way things were. I set my tray down on the counter. I wasn't hungry anymore. I walked back to the docking ring, and I found Captain Yusuf Adisa standing outside the Meridian's airlock with his arms crossed, and his jaw set in that way he had when he was thinking something through before he let himself feel it. "You heard," I said. "I heard," he said. We stood there for a while. Through the station's observation ports, you could see the slow traffic of Concordat vessels moving in their authorized lanes, green navigation lights blinking in the dark. Everything orderly, everything proceeding as it always had. "They're not wrong, you know," Yusuf said eventually, "about what we did. We were sloppy, we were arrogant, that memo." "I know," I said. "Doesn't mean I'm not angry," he said. "I know that too," I said. We recalled our crew, 11 people total. The Meridian ran lean, and we departed Caliph Station on the 28th day of our 30-day window. We didn't cut it close for drama. We cut it close because Yusuf spent 2 days filing formal protests with every Concordat office that would accept the paperwork, not because he thought it would help, but because he believed in creating an official record of objection. He was very particular about official records. We plotted a course back to the Sol system. We engaged our drive. And then, somewhere in the transit corridor, we received a navigational alert that rerouted us around a Concordat military exercise in our designated lane, which added 11 days to our journey, and took us into a region of space that, according to every chart we had, was completely empty. That navigational reroute was, in retrospect, the single most consequential accident in the history of our species. Not that it felt that way at the time. At the time, it felt like one more small indignity. Part 2, the signal. I should describe the Meridian for you, because she matters. She wasn't a new ship. Built in 2351, she'd been in service for nearly 40 years, refitted twice, but never quite to modern standards because the Jib's budget for human vessels was always the first thing cut. She was 230 meters from bow to stern, with a crew capacity of 40 but an operational crew of 11. She smelled of recycled air and someone's persistent attempt to grow basil in the hydroponics bay. Her hull plating was titanium composite. Her drives were second-generation Concordat licensed ion thrusters, and her sensor array was the thing I was proudest of, because when we'd been refitted in 2378, I'd personally argued for and won a Class 7 deep-range sensing package that was, honestly, better than anything else on a ship our size. That sensor array is why we found it. We were 11 days into the rerouted leg of our journey home. The crew was demoralized in that specific quiet way that human beings get demoralized, Not dramatically, not explosively, just muted. Meals in the galley were quieter than usual. Shifts were completed correctly but without enthusiasm. Femi, our pilot, had started doing mathematical puzzles on a physical notepad during her off hours, which she only ever did when she was processing something difficult. Akoro, our chief engineer, had begun very methodically cleaning every tool in the engineering bay, which took 3 days and involved levels of organization nobody had requested. I wrote in my journal, and I reread old research papers, and I tried not to think about the 47 half-finished projects I'd left behind in my Caliph Station lab. On the 11th day, Priya knocked on my cabin door at 2:17 hours ship time. Priya Nair was 26 years old at the time of these events. Junior analyst, technically. She'd been seconded to the Meridian from the JIB's linguistic division 8 months earlier to assist with a translation project that was now, obviously, moot. She had an extraordinary mind, the kind that connected things sideways, that noticed patterns other people didn't think to look for. She also had the particular flaw of being unable to sit still when something was interesting, which is why she was knocking on my door at 2:17. "Dr. Voss," she said when I opened the door, still half asleep, "I need to show you something." I looked at her face. Her eyes were wide, and there was something in them I hadn't seen in 11 days, something alive and sharp and uncertain, in the way that only genuinely new things make you uncertain. "Give me 2 minutes," I said. She gave me 45 seconds. The sensor room was the warmest space on the Meridian, mainly because Akoro had never quite solved a persistent heat dissipation problem in the relay banks, and also because I'd put so many additional processing modules in there that the cooling systems were perpetually overworked. It smelled of hot electronics, and faintly of the cardamom tea Priya had been drinking all evening. She pulled up the display and stepped back so I could see. "It started about 3 hours ago," she said. "I was running the standard background sensor sweep. I do it every night when I can't sleep. It's something to do, and I picked this up." On the display, against the flat darkness of surveyed empty space, there was a pattern. Not a blip. Not a single anomalous reading. A pattern repeating, complex, too structured for natural phenomenon, too regular for interference. It was emanating from a point source approximately 4.3 light hours to our starboard, from an area our charts showed as nothing. No star, no planetary body, no navigational marker. "I thought it was a ghost signal," Priya said. "Some kind of sensor artifact, so I ran diagnostics. And the array's clean. It's a real signal." She paused. "I ran it through the translation protocols. All of them, including the older JIB codebooks that we're technically not supposed to use anymore because the Concordat considers them outdated. And I can't identify the language," she said. "Not even the language family. It doesn't match anything in the Concordat database or in any of our own collected xenolinguistic records. And Dr. Voss," she stopped, started again. "The transmission structure itself, the way it's organized, it's genuinely, completely unfamiliar." I stared at the display for a long time. Outside the Meridian in the dark, something was talking. "Wake the captain," I said. Yusuf was not a person who panicked. I want to make that very clear, because what I'm about to describe could give the wrong impression. He was not someone who panicked, and he was not someone who rushed into things. He was a deliberate man who had captained a research vessel for 16 years without a single incident that wasn't eventually resolved by careful thinking. When I showed him the signal, he sat down in the sensor room and he looked at it for 4 minutes without speaking. "It's not in the Concordat nav database," he said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Priya said. "Nothing within 3 light years of this coordinate is flagged, not even an old survey marker." "So either the Concordat doesn't know it's there," Yusuf said slowly, "or they know and they didn't flag it." Or, I said, "they haven't looked." He turned and looked at me. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. "We're on a direct course to Earth," he said. "We have a homeward heading and a legal obligation to maintain it. Our Concordat authorization is canceled. We are not supposed to be conducting any scientific activity in their space." "With respect, Captain," I said, "are we in their space?" He looked at the nav display. We were in the buffer zone, that strange unmapped fringe between the edge of Concordat territorial claims and the vast surveyed but unclaimed outer dark. Technically, no one's jurisdiction. Technically, no one's anything. "That signal is 4 light hours to starboard," I said. "I know," he said. "We could divert, investigate. If it's nothing, we're back on course in 3 days. If it's something. If it's something, we've just stuck our expelled, legally suspended human hands into something that isn't ours to touch," Yusuf said. He wasn't wrong. I knew he wasn't wrong. "But we'll write it down," I said. "Whatever it is, we'll have a record." He was quiet for a very long time. 4 light hours, he said finally. "Full sensor passive only until we know what we're approaching. Nobody transmits anything. We take a look and then we make a decision." "Yes, sir," Priya said immediately. "Marin," he said, using my given name, which he did rarely, "if this goes badly—" "I know," I said. "I'll write it down anyway." Part 3, the approach. We changed course at 3:16 hours, and we told the crew at 700 breakfast. The reactions were various. Femi, our pilot, nodded once and said coordinates, with such immediate practicality that I found myself genuinely moved. She had brown eyes and a way of going very still when she was concentrating, and she'd been flying research vessels since she was 22. She didn't need to think about whether to go. She just needed to know where. Akoro, our engineer, finished his tea, set the mug down carefully and said, "The port thruster coupling has a 17-hour service interval due in about 12 hours. I'll push it through before we arrive," which was his way of saying yes. Thomas, our communications officer, looked at the signal data Priya had printed out and said "Christ" very softly, which was about as emphatic as Thomas ever got. Dr. James Okonkwo, our xenobiologist, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who had studied alien life forms for 30 years and had the patient, particular stillness of someone who had waited a very long time for something, said nothing at all. He just closed his eyes for a moment, opened them again, and stood up and went to his lab. I found him there 20 minutes later, quietly and methodically preparing sampling equipment that he hadn't touched in a year. "James," I said. "Don't," he said. "Don't tell me not to get my hopes up." "I was going to say be careful," I said. He looked at me. "Right," he said, "you too." We approached slowly. Yusuf insisted on it. Passive sensors only, the meridians active, array dark and cold. Nothing broadcasting. Nothing that could be interpreted as a response to the signal until we understood what the signal was. Priya worked continuously for 36 hours. I worked alongside her for most of that, taking breaks only when Yusuf physically appeared in the sensor room doorway and told me to eat something. The signal was extraordinary. The more we analyzed it, the stranger it became. It wasn't a distress call. It wasn't a navigational beacon. The closest analogy we had was a library catalog. Structured, layered, organized into what appeared to be categories within categories, all of it broadcasting in a steady, patient loop. "It's been broadcasting for a while," Priya said on the second day of approach. "The signal degradation patterns, the way it's worn around the edges, kind of. It's been running for a long time." "How long?" I asked. She ran numbers. She ran them again. She showed me the output with an expression that was caught somewhere between excitement and something closer to vertigo. "A very long time." "That's not possible," Thomas said from across the room. "The numbers are what they are," Priya said. "Something can't broadcast that long without—" Thomas stopped. He looked at the display. Without what? Without maintenance, without someone tending it. He shook his head slowly. So it's automated. Or whoever built it, Priya said carefully, is very patient. The source resolved on our passive sensors on the 39th hour of approach. And I need to take a moment here, because I've tried several times to describe what the display showed when it came clear, and every attempt I've made sounds either flat and inadequate or overwritten in the way that happens when you're trying too hard to make something real sound real. So I'm going to tell you what Femi said, because she was the one watching the display when it resolved, and she was the most unromantic person on that ship, and she said, "Oh my God. That's what it looked like. That's the appropriate response." What the sensors had found at the coordinates of the signal source was a structure. Not a ship, a structure. Stationary, anchored to nothing, suspended in open space. The scale was difficult to process at first because there was nothing nearby to give it context. And then we calculated it and recalculated it because the first answer didn't seem right. And eventually we arrived at a number that was correct, and that number was approximately 40 kilometers from end to end. It was dark. No running lights, no active emissions except the signal itself, which was apparently broadcast on a separate low-power system from whatever had once powered the rest of it. The hull, if that's what it was not a material in our database. Not metal, not composite, not any variant of the structural alloys the Concordat used. It absorbed our passive sensor pings in a way that made the return data strange and layered, like trying to read something through several sheets of translucent material stacked together. The shape was not ship-like. It was more like, I wrote this in my journal and I stand by the description, like someone had taken 7 different architectural traditions and woven them together into something that was simultaneously familiar and entirely foreign. Curved forms and angular ones. Structures that suggested function and others that suggested something else entirely, something aesthetic or ceremonial. It was enormous and it was ancient and it was there, in a region of space that every Concordat chart said was nothing, had always been nothing, was of no interest or significance whatsoever. They didn't know, Yusuf said. He was standing behind Femi, arms crossed, staring at the display. The Concordat. They surveyed this region and they didn't find it. Or they found it and they chose not to catalog it, Akoro said. Our sensor array, I said. The Class 7 package. It's better than standard Concordat survey gear, specifically better at detecting low-emission sources. Everyone in the bridge was quiet for a moment. You're saying a Concordat survey ship would have missed it, Yusuf said. A standard Concordat survey ship doing a standard survey pass, I said. Yes, I think so. The signal is designed to be subtle, the structure's passive. Unless you have the right equipment and you're actively looking for anomalies. But we weren't actively looking either, Priya said. No, I said. We were just passing by, with better ears than anyone expected. Part 4, the approach and entry. We spent 3 days in close observation before anyone suggested going inside. It was James who said it first, which surprised no one. He'd been cataloging every sensor return with the focused intensity of a man who'd waited 30 years to find something genuinely new, and by day 3, he had 17 dense pages of notes and a sustained low-level excitement that expressed itself mainly as a complete inability to sit down. The signal is coming from inside, he said at the day 3 briefing. It's not an external transmitter. Something in the interior of that structure is broadcasting. That means there's internal space. That means there could be. There could be anything, Yusuf said. Yes, James said, exactly. I mean that as a caution, James. I know you do. He looked around the table. We have an unprecedented xenobiological find sitting 40 kilometers from our starboard bow. We are a research vessel with a trained crew and functional EVA equipment and sample protocols that I have spent 2 decades refining. The galaxy told us to go home, and instead accidentally we found this. He stopped, looked at his hands. Captain, we have to go in. Yusuf looked at me. Marin. He's right, I said. We can't document this from outside, not properly. And this needs to be properly documented. For the record, Yusuf said, I want everyone to note that I have reservations. Noted, said the room, in the specific overlapping way that happens when people agree unanimously about something. I have reservations, Yusuf repeated, and we're going in. The EVA team was small. Yusuf, myself, James, and Priya. Thomas stayed aboard to manage communications. Femi stayed at the helm. Akoro stayed in engineering because if anything went wrong with our systems, we needed him exactly where he was. Akoro, before we left, handed each of us a small package, emergency beacon, hand-fabricated in engineering over the past 2 days, tuned to a frequency that was outside any Concordat band. If something happens, he said, and I can't reach you on standard comms, I'll track you on this. He didn't say what something happens meant. He didn't need to. We suited up. We took the secondary airlock to avoid disturbing the Meridian's main pressure envelope. We launched. EVA is always quiet in a way that nothing else is quiet. There's the sound of your own breathing and the soft static of the suit systems, and everything outside is silence. Not the silence of an empty room, which has air in it and small ambient sounds, but the actual silence of vacuum, which has nothing. You feel it more than hear it. The structure grew as we approached, and I want to describe this carefully, because approaching it on the EVA felt very different from watching it on a display. At 40 kilometers on the sensor screen, it had been impressive but abstract. At 1 kilometer, on a short thruster burn with nothing between you and it but empty space, it was something else. It was old. You could feel it. I know that sounds irrational, you can't feel age. There's no sensory mechanism for it. Space doesn't carry information that way. But there was something about the scale of it and the patience of it, just hanging there, dark and still, and broadcasting its quiet library signal into the void. That made the back of my neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the awareness that you were very small and very new, and you had just stumbled into something that had been waiting a very, very long time. There, James said over the suit comm. He was pointing to a section of hull midway along the structure's longest axis. That section, the sensor returns are different there, less dense. There's a gap, I think. He was right. There was a gap, not a door exactly, not in any recognizable sense, but a section of the hull material that was thinner or structured differently or both, a place where the geometry changed in a way that suggested access. It took us 40 minutes with portable scanning equipment to confirm it, and another 20 minutes to figure out how to open it, which turned out to involve pressing on 3 specific points of the hull surface simultaneously with EVA gloves, which is either a brilliant security mechanism or the most intuitive design choice we'd ever encountered. Because once James discovered that applying pressure to one point caused a faint vibration in 2 adjacent sections, the rest followed naturally. The section opened inward. Slowly, silently, in the vacuum, a segment of hull material rotated inward around an axis that was, and this took us several minutes of examining to confirm, not physically attached to anything we could identify. It moved as though the material itself was reconfiguring, rather than hinging on a mechanism. Beyond the opening was darkness. "We go in," Yusuf said. We went in. Part 5 inside. Our suit lights caught the interior in fragments, the way any new space catches the light of a single torch. Edges of things, angles of things, the suggestion of vast space beyond the reach of the beam. The chamber we'd entered was roughly cylindrical, about 12 meters across, and it extended into darkness in both directions along its length. The walls, the interior walls, different in texture from the exterior hull, were covered. I don't mean decorated. I mean covered every surface, floor to ceiling along every meter of visible length, in something that our instruments identified as a form of writing. Not carved, not painted. Something between the two. The material was marked at depth, the marks filled with a substance that had a slightly different reflective index than the surrounding wall, so that in our light they appeared as a dark, rich inscription against a slightly lighter background. Dense, organized, line after line after line, column after column, the whole interior of the structure apparently a single vast written text. "It's a library," Priya said. Her voice was very soft. "It's actually a library, that's what the signal was. It's been broadcasting the contents of this place." "A library that seals itself and hides in the dark," Yusuf said. "And broadcasts very quietly to anyone who might be close enough and equipped enough to hear," I said. "Not hiding, waiting." James had his scanner out and he was moving slowly along the nearest wall, running readings, and I watched his face through his helmet visor, and I watched the expression on his face change from professional focus to something raw and complicated that I'd never seen on him before. "What?" I said. "The writing," he said. "My translator isn't finding matches, which we expected, but look at the structural patterns, the repetitions, the organizational logic." He turned to look at me. "This isn't one language. This isn't one species." "What do you mean?" "I mean there are multiple languages here. Multiple scripts, multiple syntactic structures, multiple. This isn't one civilization's library. This is a record of multiple civilizations." He stopped, started over. "Someone collected them over a very long time. Someone went to multiple different species and recorded their languages, their knowledge, their whatever they considered worth recording, and they brought it all here and they wrote it down and they locked it in this room and they set it broadcasting and they—" He stopped again. "James," I said. "They're not here," he said. "Whoever did this, they're gone. This is what they left behind. This is the thing they made to outlast them." The four of us were quiet for a while. Outside the structure, 4 light towers away, the Meridian held position in the empty dark. Beyond her, the transit corridor we'd been rerouted away from carried its ordinary traffic. And further beyond that, in the vast organized space of the galactic concordat, 1,700 species went about the business of their civilization, none of them knowing we were here. "We start recording," Yusuf said finally. His voice was steady. "Everything, every centimeter of this place. We record it all, we do it systematically, and then we figure out what we have." We spent 19 days inside the structure. I want to be honest about those 19 days. They were not all wonder. They were not the sustained, cinematic experience of discovery that I think people expect when they imagine something like this. Discovery, in the real practice of it, is long. It's exhausting. It's repetitive. It involves a lot of very careful work that hurts your back and strains your eyes and makes your neck ache because you're holding a scanning instrument at an awkward angle for hours at a time. It involves arguments about methodology and disagreements about priorities and moments of total blank frustration, when the data doesn't resolve into meaning no matter how many times you rerun the analysis. But then there were the other moments, and those were— Let me just describe what we found. The structure, we started calling it the archive, because it was the closest word we had, comprised 43 interior chambers connected by passages that also bore writing. The chambers varied in size from small, almost intimate spaces of 4 or 5 meters across to one vast central chamber that was nearly 300 meters in diameter and rose to a ceiling so high that our suit lights barely reached it. In that central chamber, the writing wasn't on the walls. It was in the air, not literally, of course, but in a display medium that we spent 4 days trying to understand and eventually concluded was a kind of embedded field technology, something that could project structured information into the visible spectrum when powered. Currently unpowered, but our instruments could read the field itself. the encoded information within it, even without the display active. Priya was the one who figured out that the field was modular, not a single display but an array of them, organized exactly like a library stacks, the information arranged spatially so that you could navigate between different sections by moving through the room. She cried when she worked that out. She was sitting on the floor of the central chamber with her scanner and her notepad, and she worked it out, and then she sat very still for about 30 seconds, and then she cried. Quietly behind her visor, where she probably thought no one could tell. I could tell. James cataloged what he called biological inscriptions, sections of the writing that, once Priya had made enough progress on the structural patterns to give us a partial key, appeared to describe living organisms. Not just organisms, but entire ecosystems, entire histories of biological development, detailed enough that James became convinced. And this is the conclusion he's been defending in papers ever since, that with sufficient resources, the biological information in the archive could, theoretically, allow reconstruction. Not just description, reconstruction. Of species, of ecosystems, of worlds. Someone documented, James told me, on day 14, in the quiet of his improvised workspace at the edge of the third chamber. That's what they did. They went to these worlds, and they documented them before. Before what? I asked. He was quiet for a while. I'm not certain yet, he said, but some of the species documented here, when I cross-reference the stellar coordinates embedded in the inscriptions with known astronomical data, some of those stars don't exist anymore. Some of those systems are dead. He looked at me. This wasn't a contemporary project. This archive, whoever made it, they were doing this over a very, very long span of time, documenting civilizations that were already gone when they started, and documenting ones that were alive. Including, I said slowly, maybe civilizations that are still alive. He looked at me. Including, he said, the Concordat. Part 6, what we found in the vault. On the 16th day, Priya found the vault. It was in the final chamber, the last space we hadn't fully mapped, at the structure's furthest end. The chamber was small, barely 4 meters in any dimension, but the entire floor was a single inscribed surface that was different in character from everything else we'd encountered. Denser, more deliberately organized. The lines of text arranged in a radial pattern from a central point. In the center of that radial pattern was a physical object. I need to describe this carefully because I know how it sounds and I know how people have described it since, sometimes with more drama than accuracy. It wasn't glowing. It wasn't pulsing with mysterious energy. It was just sitting there on the floor, a small object maybe 20 centimeters across, made of the same material as the archive's hull but worked into a different shape, rounded, smooth, with subtle surface variations that our instruments read as intentional, but that we could not initially interpret. James scanned it for 4 hours before he let anyone touch it. It's not dangerous, he said. I can't detect any energetic properties, no radiation, no chemical hazard. It's essentially inert. And the inscriptions around it, Priya asked. She'd been working on the radial text for the full 4 hours. She sat back on her heels and looked at her notepad, and then she looked at the object, and then she said, "It's instructions." Instructions for what? Yusuf asked. For the object. Or for whoever finds it, she looked up. My translation is approximate, very approximate, but this section here, she pointed to the inner ring of the radial pattern. I think it says something like, for the species who comes after, what we learned, what we carried, what we believed. This holds the summary. Nobody said anything for a moment. And this section here, she pointed to the outer ring, I think this is a list of the civilizations, the ones they documented, all of them. She was right. We would spend weeks and then months and then years confirming that she was right. The outer ring of that inscription was a comprehensive catalog of every civilization whose knowledge had been gathered into the archive. their names, in their own languages and in the language of whoever had built the archive, their locations, their approximate dates of contact. There were over 300 of them. Some were species in the Concordat. Some were species the Concordat had no record of. Some, as James had suspected, were species whose home systems were now dead, whose civilizations existed only in this archive, saved by whoever had cared enough to come and write it all down. And there, in the catalog, in a notation that matched the stellar coordinates of our own system, in script that Priya would spend 3 weeks fully translating. Earth. I'm going to tell you what that felt like, being in that room, reading over Priya's shoulder as she pointed to the notation and confirmed it again. It felt, honestly, like the floor had dropped out from under me without me actually falling. Because the notation wasn't just a location. It wasn't just a "we observed them and moved on." It was a full entry, the same length and format as the other civilization entries in the Outer Ring, and what it said, translated as accurately as Priya was eventually able to render it, was: the Earthborn, a young species, still early in formation. They move without patience, but they hunger for knowledge, for connection, for meaning. They make mistakes that older species have already made and cannot imagine making again. They carry something that the older species have mostly set down. We watch them for a long time. We believe they are important, not for what they are yet, for what they choose to become. I read that 3 times standing in the vault. Who wrote this? Yusuf said. Nobody answered because nobody knew. When? He asked. Priya looked at her numbers. Based on the archive's age and the notation's position in the catalog structure, and this is very rough, this entry was probably added within the last 2,000 years, maybe less. 2,000 years. Something had been watching Earth for the past 2,000 years and writing things down about us, and the things it wrote were not what the Galactic Concordat wrote. The Concordat wrote DTI scores and compliance assessments and formal observations about our failure to meet developmental thresholds. Whoever this was wrote, they carry something that the older species have mostly set down. I sat down on the floor of that vault. James sat down next to me. We sat there for a while, in our EVA suits, in the dark and ancient quiet of a space built by someone we didn't know yet, to document things they were afraid might be forgotten. They were archivists, James said. That's what they were. That's their whole civilization if this is what they left. They went around the galaxy and they wrote things down so nothing would be lost. And then they were lost, I said. But they wrote themselves down too, Priya said. She turned back to the vault's inscribed floor, tracing lines with her gloved fingers. They're in here somewhere, I think, among the 300, she looked up. We just have to find them. Part 7, What We Carried Back. We left the archive on the 19th day. Not because we were finished. We were nowhere near finished. We could have spent years in there and not exhausted what it contained. But because we had what we needed to make the case, and because our supplies were running low, and because Yusuf made the call that the right thing to do now was to go home and bring this to people who could do it properly. I disagreed with him initially. I want to be honest about that. I wanted to stay. I wanted another month, another 6 months. I wanted to take the small object from the vault and sit with it until I understood it. I wanted to stay until I could read every word of every inscription on my own, without instruments, without translation software, because that's the irrational impulse of every linguist who encounters a text they can't read. They want to live in it until they can. Yusuf was right and I was wrong. What I wanted was a luxury we didn't have yet. We extracted data, as much as our equipment could hold, which was substantial, because James had thought to bring the full suite of xenobiological recording equipment, and Priya had brought 3 redundant data cores that she'd originally intended for her translation project. We photographed every surface we could reach. We mapped the chambers in 3 dimensions. We recorded 12 hours of video footage. We took physical readings of the hull material and the field technology in the central chamber. We did not take the object from the vault. We documented it completely, and we left it where it had been placed, by whoever had placed it, for whatever reason they'd had for putting it in the center of that room. On the last day, before we sealed the entry point, Priya stood at the opening for a long moment and looked back at the interior. Her suit light caught the nearest stretch of inscribed wall. "Someone spent their whole civilization doing this," she said. "Their entire reason for existing, finding things worth preserving and preserving them." She paused. "I wonder if they were lonely. I wonder if they knew they'd outlast themselves," James said. "They must have," she said. "That's why they built it to last. That's why it's broadcasting. They wanted to be found." We sealed the entry. We returned to the Meridian. We plotted a course for Earth. We did not report our discovery on any Concordat-accessible channel, because our authorization was canceled, and we had no legal standing in Concordat space, and Yusuf was extremely clear about not giving them any reason to intercept us before we reached home waters. We flew in silence for 11 days, and we talked about what we'd found for approximately 11 hours of every day of those 11 days. There are things I need to say about those 11 days of conversation, because I think they're as important as anything we found in the archive itself. We argued. That's the first thing. We argued about what it meant, who'd built it, why they'd left, whether the Concordat knew about it, whether the Concordat should know about it, what Earth's government would do with the information, whether we were heroes or criminals or both. Thomas, who'd stayed aboard during the EVA excursions and had been living with this secret through our daily comm updates, had thoughts, many thoughts, which he'd been holding carefully in reserve. On the second day of the transit home, he came to my cabin, and he laid out his argument with the quiet precision of someone who'd been rehearsing it for 2 weeks. "The Concordat has a record of a lot of things," he said, "but they didn't know about the archive. That means either their survey technology couldn't find it, or they didn't look, or," he paused, "or they found it and cataloged it and kept quiet about it because the information inside it is uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable how?" I asked. "Dr. Voss," he said, "in that catalog of 300 civilizations, how many are Concordat members?" I thought about Priya's cross-reference work. A significant number, maybe 60, 70 species that we can tentatively identify. "And the archive was built by someone who isn't a Concordat member," Thomas said. "Who predates the Concordat, maybe. Who had a completely different relationship with all of those species than the Concordat has. Who, if the notation about Earth is any indication, had a completely different opinion about some of those species." I saw where he was going. "The Concordat's authority," I said slowly, "rests partly on them being the oldest and most complete repository of galactic knowledge and history." "And if they're not," Thomas said. I sat with that. "Thomas," I said, "that's enormous," he said. "I know." Yusuf called a full crew meeting on day 7. Everyone gathered in the galley, which was the only space on the Meridian large enough for all 11 of us to be in the same room without tripping over each other. Yusuf stood at one end of the long table with his coffee cup, and he waited until everyone was settled, and then he said, "We're going to talk about what happens when we reach Earth, and I want everyone to say what they actually think, not what they think I want to hear." The conversation lasted 4 hours. The positions were roughly as follows. James believed the information in the archive was primarily a scientific matter, belonging to the scientific community, to be shared openly, analyzed thoroughly, and published. He was adamant that attempting to control it or leverage it politically would be both wrong and foolish. Priya believed it was a linguistic and cultural matter of extraordinary significance, and that the immediate priority was a proper translation team. not just human linguists but xenolinguists, and that this would require cooperation that Earth couldn't currently offer without Concordat assistance. Thomas believed it was a political matter first and everything else second, and that we needed legal counsel and diplomatic guidance before we said a single word publicly about what we'd found. Femi, who spoke less than anyone in these discussions but thought more, said she believed the Earth government would handle this badly and that we should prepare for that. Akoro said he believed we had stumbled into something that was intended to be found, that the beings who built the archive wanted it to be found by someone, and that the right response to that was to honor the intention behind it rather than immediately subordinating it to our political situation. I said I believed all of them were partially right. Yusuf listened to everyone, refilled his coffee twice, and at the end of the 4 hours he said, "We report to Earth Authority first. We give them everything transparently. We advocate clearly for open scientific engagement. And if Earth Authority tries to bury it for diplomatic reasons, for political reasons, for any reason, we go over their heads, to the public, to the press, to anyone who will listen." He looked around the table. "We didn't find this to keep it. Is that understood?" It was understood.